Greetings everyone, my name is Stefano Gualeni. I'm a professor at the University of Malta, and the title of my talk today is Virtual World-Weariness. In case you want to know more about me or want to follow my academic adventures, you can look me up on Twitter. As I was saying, I work at the University of Malta, specifically at the Institute of Digital Games. In case you didn't know where Malta was, I prepared this slide for you to have a clue where I'm working, which is that tiny island at the bottom of the image with the dark circle surrounding it. Kind of neat, eh? I have been a game designer since, well, as long as I can remember. I started on a system that was called the Amiga 500. Many of you will not even know or remember it existed. That was 1995 when I had my first commercial title credited. I worked on a number of titles that you might have played in the past, and on a number of other titles that you likely have not played. This one, for example, only came out in Germany and France. And this one was only available for 3 or 4 years on the iPad before it became obsolete and could no longer be played due to problems with the technology, with libraries used by Apple, and the general obsolescence of software. Think about it. We can still read Plato's book that are over 2,500 years old, and we cannot play applications that were available a few years back in the market, which is an interesting point to make in itself, but probably not for this talk. In more recent years, I helped teams like PlayLogic or Giant Sparrow with their nice little PlayStation titles. And then I threw all this promising career down the drain by studying philosophy and becoming a professional academic. At least my friends think I threw it in the garbage, my career. Instead, I think it's great to be in academia, and also my past experience with world making and digital game design are not obsolete or useless for philosophy. In fact, in my work, I try to use the design of virtual worlds, sometimes for playful, sometimes not, as ways to deal with our philosophical past and redigest some famous philosophical questions or ideas. Moreover, I think that through the design of virtual worlds, we could even come up with new questions and better ideas that could not be possible to be had before we had such close proximity and such familiarity with the digital medium. So I think I didn't waste my youth by making video games and then becoming a philosopher, but I see the two careers as being complementary. Now, to continue on this slide, I do not know who is going to be listening to this talk specifically, but I imagine that you are going to be familiar with the figure on the left-hand side of this picture, which is Super Mario, a famous video game character and one of the biggest IPs of Nintendo. But you might not be as familiar with the figure on the right-hand side of the picture. In case you didn't know that, this is the picture of a 19th century German philosopher called Friedrich Nietzsche. Why talking about Nietzsche in this presentation? You will get to know that soon. Well, this is a picture of Nietzsche as a young man when he was a soldier in the Franco-Prussian War. During that conflict, Nietzsche was injured, and especially he started losing eyesight from a very young age. Later on in his life, he suffered not only a mental condition due to his syphilis, but also a worsening of the wounds that he received and the injuries that he received during the war. And so it was that he could not continue writing, neither for what concerned his correspondence with other thinkers and philosophers of his time, nor his books. And so what happened? This is an instrument called the Molding-Hansen writing ball. And so Nietzsche was losing his eyesight. He was on the verge of being completely blind. And when he learned about this new invention, which is, as you can tell probably by the setup, a predecessor of the typewriter, Nietzsche jumped at the possibility of writing without looking. In fact, similar to how you use the keyboard of your computer or the mobile, if you play around long enough with the key and the controls, you are soon capable of doing it almost automatically without necessarily looking at the screen or the keyboard. In this case, here you see it's like a quite rudimentary machine. There's a ink ribbon under a sort of hemisphere with buttons in it, so that the buttons would push a certain symbol through the ribbon onto the paper that is positioned into that onto that arched surface underneath. So, upon Nietzsche's adoption of the writing ball, one of his closest friends, the writer and composer Heinrich Koselleck, which you see in this picture, noticed a change in the philosopher's writing style. And in one of the letters between Nietzsche and Koselleck, we read, "Perhaps you will, through this instrument, even take to a new idiom," Koselleck commented in a letter. And Nietzsche responded, obviously, that he agreed. He thought that his thoughts were changing, and the way in which he was using language and composing sentences changed dramatically, having to, in a way, have it all worked out in his mind before typing it out. It became a different kind of job than writing with his hand. Koselleck commented as a musician that is quite a natural thing for somebody who's accustomed to work with music and instruments. Different instruments, different qualities of the paper where you write your music down might lead to different compositions. Thinking of a tuba might lead to a completely different setup. So rather a completely different kind of musical composition. Because the instrument has certain possibilities and capabilities that other things have not. The writing ball afforded certain ways of thinking and writing that, for example, the pen and paper setup of the previous Nietzsche's age did not. What the two friends were agreeing on is that ultimately the socio-technical context in where you perform an action like writing or thinking matters to the action of writing and thinking. "You are right," Nietzsche replied to his friend. "Our writing equipment takes part in the forming of our thought." A similar idea was proposed about 60 years later by Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, which you see represented here in this picture, which was then recolored quite badly. In the Blue Book, which is a posthumous publication of Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher remarked that we may say that thinking is essentially the activity of operating with signs. This activity is performed by the hand, when we think by writing, by the mouth and the larynx, when we think by speaking. We may, he continued, legitimately employ expressions like we think with our mouths, or we think with a pencil and a piece of paper. Now, we could comment on whether the use of language equals thinking, right, which seems to be the association that Wittgenstein is proposing here, but that is not really the point. Regardless of whether we're talking about writing or thinking, our socio-technical environment, as I said just before, contributes and shapes those activities. After Wittgenstein, a professor in Budapest, Christoph Nyíry, similarly applied those ideas to working with computers and thinking with word processors. So the point that this professor is making is that as far as language production is concerned, also the computer as a technology has a shaping influence in how we build sentences, how we perform the activities of thinking and writing. I think it's quite obvious, right? Think about it in your own practice as students. If you didn't have the possibility of, say, deleting, copying, pasting, sharing your document, keeping it in a state of flow, but had to instead write it down, whatever you're thinking or whatever assignment you're working on, perfectly in one go, as it was the case with pen and paper. You would be thinking and working on your assignment and on your text in a very different manner. A similar idea, still in the vein of thinking about how the social technical environment shapes our thinking and writing, was proposed by British linguist Margaret Masterman. In 1962, on the supplement of the Times, on the Sunday Times, she wrote an article titled "A Telescope for the Mind." And in this article, she compared the potential of computers to transform our conception of the world to the invention of the telescope in the 17th century. Similar to that invention Masterman proposed, the computer will give rise to a number of changes in other disciplines, similar to how the telescope changed, say, the disciplines of geography, astronomy, and even optics. But that's not all. The computer will not only have an impact on science and how sciences are pursued, but also in our self-understanding and in how we understand our position in the cosmos. In the West, or in Western culture, the invention of the telescope had also a profound impact on our religious views, right? Galileo and Giordano Bruno could probably testify this if they were still among us. What I'm trying to do with this talk is something similar to what we have seen up until now. So prove to you, or in a way demonstrate a particular way in which a technology, the computer in this case, is transforming us, is shaping us, is changing our capability for thinking, producing, writing, reflect on ourselves and relate to other people. So what I'm trying to make here is a point about computers as a technology, and in particular about computers in their capability to disclose the interactive experience of virtual worlds. So I'm not even focusing on computers alone, but also in a subset of our uses of computer, which is that of, well, creating interactive world-like experiences. Now, obviously, it's quite important for you to understand what I'm saying, that I define what a world is, and that definition or that discussion is coming up really soon. I just wanted to point out that when I talk about virtual worlds of computers, I do not talk about serious applications necessarily, or screen-based applications. Regardless of how playful or how immersive our access to virtual worlds are, they remain very much the same technology with very much the same effect, I claim. And for that reason, so considering virtual worlds as having a shaping possibility in our thought and opening up and disclosing new avenues for the ways in which we think about ourselves, the others, religion, science, and so on and so forth, that, as I told you at the beginning, I don't think my youth was wasted. Becoming familiar with digital technology was a great advantage over other philosophers of technology and game scholars who didn't have that training, who didn't have that experience. And so, as an academic, I write books precisely about this topic. This is a book of mine that came out in 2015. This is a book to which I contributed that came out in 2018. And this is the most recent production of mine and Daniel Vella, which came out in 2020. All the three books deal with very much this topic. Can we use virtual worlds for philosophy? What are the shaping influences and the rhetorical and transformative capabilities of digital worlds that we could employ to potentially raise better children, have a more fair and just society, to think better about a future, to have a more flexible mind towards change, to dispel the impossibility of social transformation, and so on and so forth. But, as I was saying, I am not only an academic that writes books. I'm not only like a, say, follower of Nietzsche. I'm also a maker of Super Marios. You might have encountered some of the games that I make to show, illustrate, manipulate philosophical ideas or thought experiments, for example. I made one in 2017 called Something Something Soup Something that was meant to reflect on some ideas of the philosopher that we already mentioned before and encountered earlier, Ludwig Wittgenstein. As a case in point, if you go on my website and if you look at the tabs on top of the screen, you will see that, like many other academics, I have a collection of papers and books in which my ideas are spelled out and, let's say, elaborated on textually. But there is also a games feature, a games sub-page, in which my games for philosophy and my playable thought experiments are freely available for you. So in this way, I hope I demonstrated to you that I'm not only talking the talk, but I'm also walking the walk. I do believe virtual worlds are possible tools for social transformation and philosophy, among many other things, and I'm actually showing how to do it hands-on. I make games that prove my point. Neat, eh? Having done all this introduction, I think it's about time that we start with the actual content of this talk, virtual world-weariness. As you can tell from the title, the talk will involve thoughts and definitions, including those of virtuality, worldliness, and world-weariness. Let's get started. I will begin by defining what I mean by world. So what is a world? In the tradition of phenomenology, which is a philosophical branch of last century, which is still active right now, the term world indicates a set composed of beings that are understood together with all their properties and mutual relationships. That is not the end of the definition because, to be more specific, a world indicates this set of things and properties as understood and experienced by one of the beings involved in this system. So to be in a world is also to understand and participate it from a particular subjective standpoint. So whenever I talk about world, I talk about the subjective experience of a system of which I am part. Is that all there is to the definition of world? No, not really, no, but this is a good beginning. To be recognized as a world, in fact, the set that we described in the previous slide, for a world to be recognized as a world, it needs to be experienced by the subject in question, so from the subjective point of view that we described earlier, in ways that are persistent and consistent. That means that in order for it to be a world and not an illusion, a dream or an hallucination, I need to be able to have a relatively stable and long relationship with it, and I need to be able to return to it at will, which makes it easier to categorize virtual worlds as, in a way, in the same league as the world we share as biological creatures. So now that we discussed what world means, whether you agree or not, from the lens of phenomenology, I hope you like the definition, like very subject-centric definition, I will go on and define another term. What does it mean for something to be virtual? Now, there are many definitions, and the history starts with Aristotle of the definition of what we mean by virtual. Like you have an original etymological one that means potentially, so as having the potential to become something else, and so on and so forth. We could go on. I actually have half a page of text that I could recite about the definitions of virtual, but I think it might be more interesting if I just go to the definition that I consider to be appropriate and usable in this context, which is using the adjective virtual as referring to something that can be interactively experienced within computer-generated environments. I think you can immediately tell that this definition is particularly useful when we talk about worlds and when we talk about computers. In fact, we can call a virtual world a world, right, a subjective experience of a stable set of somethings that can be experienced through computer generation, that is supported and underpinned by computer processes. So the subjective experience still comes from a human, needs to be somebody with a degree of consciousness. But the stimuli and the beings can be provided in a number of different ways. We are used to deal with biological beings that exist in the actual world, but we can create world-like, or we can establish world-like relationships with digital beings, provided that, as we said, they are available to us in a way that is interactive, persistent, and cognitively accessible enough. What is enough? Well, that's too good a question to spoil it with a bad answer. But I hope this is good enough for you for now. Now you should be aware and capable of understanding what I mean when I say virtual worlds. And this is a slide in which I renew my promise to you, according to which I will try to discuss convincingly and logically virtual worlds as technologies for changing, for transforming society, for philosophizing, for thinking about our future, for changing ourselves individually. And it is from that perspective that today, in this talk, I'm going to talk about world-weariness, which is a concept that, in case you're familiar with German Romantic writing, was sometimes referred to as Weltschmerz, which is, I mean, in a rough British or English translation, would sound something like a world pain, a world weariness. I'm not going to explain you right now what it means. I'm going to do that later in the talk, but for now, in relation to virtual worlds, you need to understand that it is something that has to do with a virtual world, limitations and boundaries. So it's something that relates to the ending, the confines, the possibilities offered by a virtual world. It has specifically to do with the fact that a virtual world, any virtual world, cannot be infinitely granular, nor inexhaustibly explorable, and neither it offers endless possibilities for manipulations. Virtual worlds are artifacts, and as such, they are finite creations which can only be manipulated and used, explored in a certain particular set of ways. You will understand me better once I present some examples, perhaps. Take this one. This is a screenshot of the arcade version of Outrun, a video game by Yu Suzuki, in which driving is presented in a particularly arcade fashion, and it is a game, I don't know if you've ever played it, maybe you're a bit too young, but what you can do in this game is drive forward, steer right and left, and hope to make the time before reaching the next checkpoint. In this game you cannot go backwards. You can veer right or left into the fields, but there's only so much time and so much space that you can occupy in the field. You cannot, for example, stop and have a picnic or a conversation with your co-driver. You cannot, well, look at those mountains at the horizon, those far lands, right? Those are not reachable, right? Those are just sort of decoration of the background. So this is set up as a driving game, not as anything else, and a driving game to be taken like quite lightly in the context of an arcade hall where you could play this on the cabinet. It is not a piece that allows for any other potential uses apart from, yes, annoying your friends or just standing still in the middle of the road, but that's about it. Each world as an artifact, comes with a degree of possibilities, but also with many limitations. In case you played my game 2017 something soup something, a game that I already mentioned in this talk, you know that you're more or less, as a player, confined to a kitchen. You cannot set the kitchen on fire. You cannot go in the upstairs world, so to speak. You cannot open the fridge. Or whenever you receive soups as space transmissions, you cannot decide to, say, for example, eat it. You can just accept it or not accept it as a viable piece of food for humans. So my own game comes with very specific limitations, right? This is a screenshot of From Software's, I think it's in 2015, yes, Bloodborne. And what I'm showing here is a vision that shows the inside of a character, right? Like you can, in particular occasion, position your camera inside things, like, for example, inside a wall, inside the head of a character, like in this case here. And you might notice that the inside of the character is not necessarily made of flesh, bone, veins. We're not looking at wet tissues of any kind, but it's just revealing that the head of an NPC, a non-playing character or non-player character, contains only the bare minimum to support the illusion of this character having a face looked from the outside. So there's nothing more in the game than what the game wants to show. The game is not infinitely explorable. If I look at a blade of grass, I will not see chlorophyll being pumped into its little veins, right? Do you know what I'm saying? And so In the previous 3 slides, I have shown you some video games, very different kinds from very different ages, as examples of how limited virtual worlds are. So how virtual worlds, by sort of constraining your possibilities of action and perception, guide you into a certain relationship towards these worlds. In doing so, in exemplifying these limits and boundaries, I'm only using digital games. So why am I only using digital games, besides from the fact that I really like them and I'm very familiar with it? The first reason is that you, as a viewer, might yourself be familiar with this, because the social diffusion of digital games makes them normally good examples, relatable examples, something that you might have already had a similar experience with. And secondly, in the field of game studies, which is the academic study of games and digital games, there is already a rich tradition of discussing ends, boundaries, limitations, and extremities. So in explaining you what I mean more in detail, I can rely on that tradition. Within this tradition of limitation and boundaries, studied from the point of view of game studies, is my friend Riccardo Fassone's book, Every Game is an Island, and Extremities in Video Games, in which he studies precisely the boundaries and our encounter with the boundaries of games. Very fascinating book. Similar effort, but not as specific, was pursued by Sherry Turkle in 2011 with her book Life on the Screen, published by Simon & Schuster. In this book, she proposes the idea according to which games or virtual worlds in general are limited systems, and that use their limitation to encourage people to use those worlds and be part of them in particular ways. And this absorbing of the affordances of a virtual world is so automatic that we often don't question why we are under those constraints and under those limitations. According to Sherry Turkle, as I was saying, the fact that these artifacts have limitations is a reflection of the ideologies under which they were built. And by which I mean, by ideology, I mean a system of beliefs that constitutes one's goals and determines one's actions. In case you don't know what I'm talking about, consider that ideologies are ideas that are accepted and proposed by the dominant class of a society. And these ideas are then shared by its members in often implicit ways. So by using a computer, a virtual world, or a video game, you are unknowingly, unless you think critically, under an ideological system of constraints that guides your behavior and disallows certain things and facilitates certain others. So she was projecting this idea that boundaries and the ways in which technologies are made are profoundly ideological. A similar thought, so that we are exposed to other people's and sometimes structures of power's ideological perspectives when we play video games and visit virtual worlds, is presented by American philosopher and game scholar Ian Bogost. And the idea of boundaries is very central to his discussion on persuasive games, which is a 2007 book. In that book, Ian Bogost claims that video games can, and in fact do, simulate complex situations that invite players to reflect on different courses of actions. In this case, he calls the games or virtual worlds in question as enacting a kind of procedural kind of rhetorics. So they want these games and these technologies to convince you of certain points of view and certain ideas by means of you operating within them. So in a way, like arguments are coded within these ideas in the form of rules, affordances, and limitations. And he talks about limitations in particular when he says, like, limitations are what decide what is present within a game or a world and what is left out. And this boundary constitutes the game's more or less conscious ideological positioning. So there's a very strong expressive and political, let's say, responsibility in placing the game's boundaries. more to the point of game boundaries, and perhaps a bit more readable and shorter piece, is Paolo Pedercini's essay Invisible Walls, Puffy Clouds and the Unheavenly Words Behind Them, in which he, in his own terms and in his own way, points his attention at the same thing. So the kind of political and ideological significance behind what is possible and what is not possible within games, and what their boundaries mean. So until now, we have discussed what we mean by worlds, in which sense can we call certain worlds virtual worlds, and we discussed how boundaries, ends and limitations of those virtual worlds have a profound expressive, rhetorical, ideological impact on the perception of those worlds. Now it's time to move on to perhaps the final and the most interesting part of this conversation, which is that on world-weariness. Having done all the discussion and having been through all the points that we made until now, what does it mean to be world-weary? And what was that thing called Weltschmerz that we mentioned before? Well, world-weariness is something that is, as I said, related to the limitations of boundaries of a virtual world, or of a world in general, right? Like it emerged even before we had computers. It is something that has to do with the poverty of a world. So something that appears in Romantic literature as opposed to another notion, which is that of the sublime. When we talk about the sublime, we often refer to the work of Kant, which, of course, 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, that describes the feeling of the sublime as that of being confronted with the greatness, the immense power of the forces of nature, the incredible size of natural events, from a safe perspective. Think about the explosion of a volcano or a storm brewing at the horizon, and so on and so forth. So those thoughts are often reflected and associated in romantic literature and painting with ideas like taking to the seas on a small boat, or taking a vacation in the Alps and doing some crazy excursions. In general, it has to do with engaging in perilous adventures and being exposed to the strength of and this magnitude of nature. In which, if you take these paintings, you can see that nature is normally depicted, or rather the natural environment is depicted as vast and mysterious, whereas in many of them, think of the painting of, for example, Caspar Friedrich, are depicted as small and secondary and dark and fragile, and mostly overcome by the size and the darkness and the power of all that surrounds them. And so the key idea behind many of the definitions of the sublime, which you can find if you are interested in a very handy book by Philip Shaw, relies on idea of unimaginable vastness and power, and being confronted as human beings with a body that is inadequate and frail, and a point of view which is limited in time and very small. It is also connected with ideas like try to make sense or to control phenomena that are beyond our reach, both intellectually and in terms of possibility physically, like both perceptually or even to withstand them with your own body. Feelings of unimaginable vastness and danger are normally common in science fiction literature, especially in space operas, which is why science fiction book covers or movie posters look like these and that. What they promise is the sublime, the ungraspable, the almost unthinkable vastness of space, and the irrelevance of human beings and of single lives within that context. So, if, on the one hand, the romantic sublime focused on the awe-inspiring vastness of nature and the impossibility for the human senses and the human intellect to even grasp the size and the meaning of all that, on the other hand, we have Weltschmerz. I told you, this world pain, which is almost the opposite feeling, right? It's the feeling that the world is not going to be enough, or nature, like the vastness, the great out there, is not going to be enough to satisfy our intellectual aspirations. there's never going to be enough meaning to deep into. It reflects a world which is not vast and awe-inspiring, but banal and absurd. Think about, for example, your relationship with video games, right? Look at this room, for example. You cannot examine the lines between the bricks. The space is completely limited. It is boring and flat. You could, as a player, notice how textures are repeated and light is like falsely baked into the environment. So, in a way, many aspects of this picture speak about the artifactual nature, the repetitive nature, the banality of the room that you're into, right? It's very hard to feel sublimely related to such a small, predictable, banal room. The idea that repetitions and modularity are in a way enemies of the sublime is something that you might have experienced yourself if you ever played like 2D games, right? Especially games in which movement is divided in modules and so on and so forth. This is true both for two-dimensional games and three-dimensional games, but is not limited to them. Even games and virtual worlds that are procedurally generated by computers to be vast and immense only can use so many assets to, in a way, reproduce, play, mix with one another. The reason for that is that assets are produced by human beings, or at least are perceived and taken from the actual world, meaning that no matter how good and how creative computers can be in adapting and resizing, reshaping and accommodating these pieces, it will always be possible for us to see a poverty in the way in which the world is set up. Take this picture of Castle Cairnhurst from Bloodborne, a game that I mentioned before, from Software 2015. Of course, this is aesthetically quite rich. But you need to understand that the trees, the statues, some feature of the terrain like the glass or the lamp that you see there are vastly repeated in a originally procedurally generated terrain and then reworked by the artists from software. But you will not stop noticing, the more you become familiar with this environment, the repetition of window details, on how the torches burn, on the limited amount of statues that are placed and repeated in this environment, how grass leaves are all the same and behave in a very same predictable way. So there's a degree of boredom and repetition and predictability despite the efforts of the artists and the programmers to make this look instead rich, vibrant and unique. Which is a feeling, that banality, that you also get when you engage non-player characters of video games. And as you probably experienced in your everyday life, what you get is standardized responses, or responses which are repetitive, or even dialogues that stabilize in one single option. What you see here is a picture from Zelda Breath of the Wild, Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, a 2018 Nintendo blockbuster. Very good game. And as I hope I showed you, this is not only true of games which are evidently flat and modular, like Super Mario Bros., which you're currently seeing on the screen, but is almost true, or actually exactly true, for all games. They are artifacts, and as artifacts they're finite, and they can be perfectly known and predicted. They are worlds, in other words, that can be epistemically consumed. They are possible to be explored to a point that there's nothing that they can offer anymore, nothing that they can surprise us with, nothing that they can stimulate us with or interest us with. In that regard, a friend of mine, Sebastian Möhring, recently wrote, well, not so recently in 2014, but also in a 2018 paper, he talks about that particular feeling that one gets once the levels of, for example, shooters, like the ones that I'm showing right now, which is, I think, Doom Eternal, are cleared. When missions are finished and everybody's killed within this environment, he talks about a certain feeling that is akin to one of boredom. In his article, he discusses, as examples, the banality and meaninglessness of game worlds once the challenges in it are overcome. At that point, those worlds are exhausted artifacts, and at that point, as I was saying, it is hard to feel any interest for them at all. So let me repeat. The sense of world-weariness is a close relative of the feeling of meaningless and boredom. It is almost the antithetical opposite of the sense of the sublime, according to which instead the world is so vast and there's endless possibilities and one can transcend and go beyond oneself. No, in game worlds, that is not the case. The fact that you are confronted with a limited artifact and maybe with a path of growth that was offered to you as a player becomes evident to you, and as soon as that is evident, you tend to stop playing as if you were in a world, but you start playing as if you were playing with a toy. This phenomenon of the emergence of virtual world-weariness was discussed in a recent paper of mine, this is 2018, which you can find in this book, Architectonics of Game Spaces. You can also find the full paper in the description of this video, in case you want to write it and go more in detail, because there's much more than I'm telling you right now, of course. And so, to conclude, whereas the Romantic poets find themselves inadequate and fragile in relation to a sense of sublime that transcends their perceptual and intellectual capabilities, we, as players and virtual world dwellers, are often underwhelmed and bored with artificial worlds. And let me finish, or rather summarize this point by saying that this is particularly evident when their artifactual nature and their finitude are encountered in the form of repetitions, limitation, and world boundaries. So this is kind of the conclusion of this introduction to what virtual Weltschmerz is, or virtual world-weariness. In my paper, however, being a game designer, working in a sort of game studies institute and being very interested in these topics, I decided to also offer solutions to this world-weariness. And not to do it myself, I also engaged with the work of many other researchers among friends and colleagues in other universities that face these issues. Many of the people that I'm going to mention in the slides that follow are games researchers, AI researchers, independent game developers, and so on and so forth, who face daily the challenge of making a world world-like and not making it feel like a consumed artifact, making a world engaging and making it keep as long as possible the promise of transcendence and exploration, as opposed to, again, wither very quickly as soon as the experience with a certain world, or the key experience with a certain world, is done. One of the first people that I interviewed for this paper is Dr. Mike Cook, a computer scientist from the United Kingdom. Emphasizing a particular kind of existential dissatisfaction that manifests itself in digital environment, researcher and developer Mike Cook, which you see here, argued that we dream of doing and being a particular thing in a world, and then we find ourselves unable to do it. It is a typical 21st century condition, to be trying our hardest to escape into a digital world or a virtual world, and then realize that we cannot act in the way we want it. It's almost like being a nightmare, in the kind of nightmare when one is unable to move one's arms or to speak. Interestingly, in the discussion that I had with Mike Cook for this paper, our awareness of virtual world has less to do with the granularity of the environment, so how much information is contained within it and how deep we can explore, for example, a patch of land, and more with its regularity. So for Mike Cook, what gets us, what makes us feel particularly world-pained, is the fact that we start noticing repetition and regularities. In order to overcome that feeling, he suggests that we use what I called in the industry, on the games industry, hero pieces, which is unique pieces, unique models that we can put in an otherwise like regular and like procedurally generated environment or set of other things such as trees and water and rocks, to give a particular area a distinct identity that cannot be repeated. For example, this is, I think, the Penta Pro Monument in Fortnite, which is a originally 2015, if I'm not mistaken, multiplayer game by Epic Games, which only exists in one specimen. So there's a very detailed, very unique piece placed in a particular area, giving it a particular flavor or giving it a particular identity. Those are called hero pieces. In your experience with video games, you might think of a particular statue or a particular fountain or a particular NPC, non-playing character, that for you is characteristic of a particular area, giving it its distinct flavor. A colleague and friend of mine, also living in Malta, Dr. Daniel Vella, has an interesting perspective of his own to offer. This is not present in my paper, but I thought it would be interesting to also mention. In his 2017 article, Daniel, the title of the paper, of course, is No Mastery Without Mystery, Dark Souls and the Ludic Sublime. So in that article, my friend and colleague Daniel focuses on the clarity and completeness of how a world is given to us, and suggests that is very crucial. Both of those things, clarity and completeness, are crucial components of our getting bored, of our having consumed a particular word. And so he suggests strategies to slow down what I call the epistemic erosion of our relationship with a game world. So he proposes, as a way to preserve interest and a sense of sublime in a game, to leave certain parts of a world undescribed, undiscussed, maybe in a state of ambiguity. If you think about it, like an example is coming. He talks about Dark Souls, right, in the title of his paper, which, let me repeat it, is called No Mastery Without Mystery, Dark Souls and the Ludic Sublime. And he discusses Dark Souls as employing many of these techniques in which the truth is never discovered. Hints are given to the player, but never quite in a decisive manner. Descriptions of artifacts within the game are often mysterious and contradictory. Things are left unexplained. Ruin and death are like almost certain and, ubiquitous in those worlds. If you think about like ruin as the unfinished and unexplained, those are very good examples, right? Like sometimes in the game of Dark Souls as well as other worlds, ruin are shown as, in a way, traces of an ancient civilization that cannot be recovered, can only be interpreted and maybe dreamt about, but we never have a concrete and final truth about what happened to that civilization, what that building was for, what made it collapse, what damaged it in that particular fashion. So the fact that the world is contradictory, mysterious, unexplained, and in ruins are, according to Daniel, part of what keeps Dark Souls enduringly interesting. It is not to say that Dark Souls remains eternally mysterious. You can indeed visit everything and have a theory about everything and collect every single object and visit every nook and cranny of every ruin. But what the game does is try, with its incompletability, or at least designed incompletability, to resist as long as possible the idea of being completely known. I hope the idea is clear to you by now. Another friend and colleague of mine in Malta, Dr. Adonis Liapis, suggests another possible solution to, in a way, overcome virtual world weariness. His solutions rely on giving the players the possibility and tools to modify, destroy, and reconstruct shared virtual environments. This technique, which we could call user-generated content, is present in many games that you might be familiar with. In Animal Crossing New Horizon, which came out last year, this year, 2020, the players have possibility to extend, customize, beautify, personalize their islands and invite other people to be part of that. And each island will be unique and responding to the unique tastes and flavors that the players bring to those islands. Another example is, for example, Satisfactory by Coffee Stain, my friends in Sweden, in which, maybe it's not as friendly and colorful as Animal Crossing, but different players can create different set of automated factories that can be shared with one another or have particularly expressive traits and so on and so forth. So giving players the capability to be creative and to make their own game spaces unique contributes to the feeling that, there is nothing special, there is nothing transcendental about those spaces at all. Those are ways to personalize and overcome the bore and the pain that we feel when worlds are too regular. user-generated content, says Adonis. My paper obviously goes into more depth than what I can offer in this brief, so to speak, presentation. I'm going to just give you a few examples of other solutions devised by researchers, in this case Mike Cook, to overcome world-weariness. Mike suggests to integrate in the design of the world data from the internet, so that environments could be in a way generated afresh, and they might contain data and information that are relevant to the current, say, political or news situation, meaning that the players will literally now have the possibility to exhaust all the content of your world because new content is generated on a daily basis. Another game scholar and independent games developer, Mark Johnson, suggests that maybe an idea of erasing all save state and information when a game session ends ensures that the unique generation of that world, in the case of a procedurally generated world, might become salient or particularly interesting, or might acquire a gravitas that it might not have otherwise when this world is dismantled and deleted once the certain play session is over. So you are 100% sure that you're never going to see that unique combination of terrains, monsters, goals, limitations, bridges, mountains, and what have you. Other developers and designers, such as Nicola Tedeschi and Mark Johnson, again, suggest that we should strive to design in ways that systemically and systematically avoid inconsistencies between architecture, narrative, world lore, and game functions. Nicola Tedeschi in particular mentions the fact that maybe it is better to even abandon the plan to try to have very detailed worlds, but maybe having simpler worlds that are suggested and whose history and complexity is suggested to the players and then can be completed by the player's interpretation and fantasy, rather than might be a better solution than, as I was saying, trying to have very detailed and realistic and stable and non-boring worlds, because he thinks that's a plan that is doomed to fail. Before we conclude this bit, which talks about the various people that I interviewed in my paper, to try to wrap my head around the problem of world-weariness and maybe provide design solutions for them, I would like to talk about my colleague Antonius Liapis once again, because in response to one of my questions, or rather as an amendment to one of my questions, Adonis admitted having experienced the feeling of virtual world-weariness, which he considers not only common but also inherent in how we currently design and experience video game worlds. So far so good. He was with me on that one. He, however, pointed out that his way of coping with virtual Weltschmerz, or virtual world pain, or this boredom that we've been discussing, the particular kind of boredom that we've been discussing in this talk, does not primarily involve the idea of returning to the actual and abandoning those worlds and try to find more meaning in the world that we were born into as biological creature. But instead, he argues, his way of dealing is just to pick up a new game. As soon as one fancy new box is consumed and fully explored, and it provides that kind of world pain, you just move to another box. You just move to another world, right? So you start to play a new game. You begin to explore a new environment, a new possibility horizon, a new promise of happiness and satisfaction. So I hope that my talk today gave you some indications of how to maybe understand what it is to be virtual. Maybe had you ponder on a possible definition of what worlds are, and maybe started to consider the problem of world-weariness from the point of view of both players and designers of virtual worlds. This was, in a way, one of the topics of the book that I wrote with Daniel Vella, who was also mentioned in this talk, Virtual Existentialism, Meaning and Subjectivity in Virtual Worlds. We do not talk specifically or openly about virtual world-weariness, but similarly, we discuss virtual worlds not as the context where we can pursue complete happiness and satisfaction, not as a place in which we could transform ourselves into something better or something more desirable and stably so, but as instruments that allow us to negotiate with various aspects of who we are in the world in ways that are not very common. I mean, it allows us to express ourselves and to make decisions and to build ourselves in ways that the actual world doesn't allow, right? We are way faster in digital games to level and change and test out other hypotheses and like restart a new path from a different angle and so on and so forth. And sometimes that fluidity of mind is not necessarily present in the way we face our lives, in which it is hard to be a student, it is hard to make a career, it is difficult to, again, adopt another gender identity and so on and so forth. And as we've seen in this talk, virtual worlds allow us to transcend some aspects of our everyday relationship with the world. We can double jump, we can refashion ourselves. But in doing so, they also reveal new ways of being limited, right? They show us new ways in which our very incompleteness as human beings can be experienced and understood. I hope that this stimulated some interesting thought. And I hope that maybe that encouraged you to either pick up the specific paper on World-Weariness that I mentioned and that you can find in the description below, or to even pick up the, let's say, more committal task of reading Virtual Existentialism. As I said, I work in Malta and I have a lot of academic adventures and ideas which I share with my Twitter friends, so if you feel so inclined, please follow me. I'm going to leave this slide for a few other seconds so that you can keep it as I suppose, a key takeaway. So the idea that we do not only transform ourselves and are free thanks to computers, but also we are given new limitations that we can kind of bump against and that allow us to think about ourselves and our problems and who we are and our identity in new fashions, in new ways. I hope this was clear, this was helpful and inspiring. If you want to continue, we also run a postgrad course in game studies and games philosophy. So yeah, thank you. I hope this was useful and somehow inspiring. Yeah. Thanks.